Good. All right. Wonderful. Okay. All right, we'll say good evening, Gezinten Zimmer. It's great, Schos Baruch Hashem, to be able to learn the daf together on Motzei Tisha B'Av. I think for many of us, before you start the daf, we're all aware of the inui, one of the forms of affliction of not learning Torah throughout Tisha B'Av. But I think once we begin the daf, and you can't begin the day with your daf, and you know that literally again throughout the entire day, you just can't open up your Gemara. It creates a certain level of beautiful and healthy and holy anxiety associated with it, and the ability after Tisha B'Av, Baruch Hashem, just able to sit down, eat a little bit, and then sit down and learn a blat Gemara is a tremendous zechus. So we'll say with that, let us begin. Today's daf is Mem Vav, Emiras Hashem 46, and we are picking up 2, 4, 6, about 8 lines down from the top. Tani Tana Kamei de Rav Sheshes. So ultimately, again, it was taught before Rav Sheshes the following halacha. What's the halacha? The Gemara says, Ha'akum ha'ovdim esaharim v'esagvos. So again, if an akum goes ahead and worships the mountains or the valleys, hein mutar v'ovdein b'sayiv. Ultimately, again, the mountains and the valleys remain mutar, but those who worship them, ultimately, again, are chayiv misa. Now, again, Abba said, this is halacha that we've already seen a number of different times already, which is that one cannot go ahead and make something that is naturally occurring into a form of Avoda Zara, especially if it's mechubar the karka. So therefore, you can't go ahead and make a mountain into Avoda Zara, you can't make a valley into Avoda Zara, but yet, if you worship it as Avoda Zara, you are chayiv misa. So in other words, the act of worship does not transform the item into an object of Avodah Zarah, yet the people who worship are actively chayiv misa. Ves hazroim ves hayirakas, if one worships seeds or vegetables, hein asurin. Ultimately, again, they are aser. Va'ovdeihen b'sayif. Ultimately, again, and those who worship them are chayiv misa. So in this case over here, halacha l'maisa again, both the objects become aser, the objects themselves become aser, and ultimately, again, those who worship it are chayiv misa. Amar lechamani. Ultimately, who told you this? Rabbi Yossi Rabbi Yehuda. The Amar, this is Rabbi Yossi Rabbi Yehuda. What does Rabbi Yossi Bar Yehuda say? Again, remember also we had this already in yesterday's daf on Mem Hamud Beis. What did Rabbi Yossi Rabbi Yehuda say? The Amar Ilon Shenatu Ulabasof Avdu. If you planted a tree, but when you planted it, you didn't plant it for any specific Avodah Zarah purpose, right? And then afterwards, Reuven just planted a regular, or we'll call him Akum, planted a regular tree. And then after he planted it, he decided to worship it for idolatrous purposes. Asr, ultimately, again, the tree is asr. So this is the shita of Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Yehuda, who holds that even if something was planted for regular reasons or non-avodah zarah reasons, and then you decided to go ahead and worship it, halacha l'maaseh it is asr. If that's the case, if Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Yehuda, v'lukma be'ilan shenata mitchil l'kach v'rabanan. So why not set it up as a case of where you initially planted the tree for avodah zarah purposes, and it could reflect the view of the Rabbanan? To which the Gemara said, lo, because we want it to be comparable to the case of the mountain. The Gemara says, a mountain, so to speak, was not planted originally for this purpose. In other words, a mountain is naturally forming and ultimately not initially created by the Ribono Shel Olam for Avodah Zarah purposes. I wanted to find a parallel case. So in the Brisa, because the Brisa quotes both about the Elon and about the Har, we want to find the case of an Elon that's comparable to the Har. So just as the Har was not quote-unquote originally planted or created for Avodah Zarah purposes, so too we want an Elon case where the Elon is also not originally created for Avodah Zarah purposes. Okay, so we'll say good. So that's the first halacha that ultimately again we have tonight. So again, if you worship the mountain or you worship the mountain and the valley remain unchanged, right? Remain unchanged. But those who worship them ultimately again will be chayiv misa. But if you go ahead and you worship, let's say metaltalin, movable property, and again I'll say obviously the piece that's missing over here is even worship of movable property, we'll see, really only becomes asr if you do something to that item. But Allah say the item could become prohibited, and ultimately again the individual is chayiv misa. Excellent. Next case, itmar avnei har shinedaldalu. Listen to this. If you have stones from a mountain that were dislodged. Now Rashi points out, first short line in Rashi, Shnidaldalu, Nekru me'elehen, Vishtachavu akum lohem. So the case over here is you have a mountain. Now we'll say, quick chazara. If you worship a mountain, what's the status of the mountain? Worship mountain, status of the mountain? Unchanged. Unchanged. But who is changed? Who is changed? Right? The worshipper. tremendous Musar Haskell, that again I will say, sometimes every action has a reaction. Sometimes the reaction is not seen in the world around us, but the reaction of every single personalistic action is always reflected within the individual himself. There is no such thing as anything and everything you do in life may or may not impact the world around you, but anything and everything you do in life absolutely, unequivocally impacts you. And this is incredibly important because I will say, again, Motzei Tisha B'Av is a good time to be honest with oneself. Now I will say, you know what's next. You know what's next. Elul. Elul. So now pretty much tonight is the beginning of Yomim Noraim. Right? It's pretty much like, right? I'm sorry? No, you went home for a little bit. No, that was the break. That was the break. Now we're back. And now it's Elul. So again, so just to understand, if we think about the psychology of sin, right? What's the psychology of sin? To be honest, you could blame Avoda on a lot of different things, but more often than not, it's because I legitimize it to myself by saying it doesn't matter, right? What does it matter if I look at something? What does it matter if what are these things? Come on, yeah, it's going to have a cosmic effect. The answer is, it's quite possible that it won't have a cosmic effect, right? If I do an Avoda, it may or may not impact the world, but one thing is absolutely clear, which is, it will impact me. Everything I do impacts me. There is no such thing as an action I engage in, big or small, that does not have a residual impact on me. And by the way, I will say, this is in positive and negative. This goes both ways. Every action changes who and what I am, so it's incredible. You can worship the mountains, and you know what? It's not going to have any effect on the mountains, but it absolutely has an effect on me. Incredible. Okay, so we'll say the next case. If you have stones of a mountain that became dislodged. Now, in this particular case over here, I will say, by the way, just to address Rabbi Shmuel's point earlier about no break, so just understand, Baruch Hashem, so now it's like, of course, everybody should go on vacations, should enjoy. So I will say, people often think that a vacation from work or a vacation, of course, you should take vacations, but a Yid is never on vacation from Ruchnius. In other words, I might go somewhere and be away from work, which is great, and relax, which is great, but outside Ruchnius, I'm always working. There's no such thing as a ben azmanim for your neshama. There's no such thing as a ben azmanim for your ruchnius. At least once you're no longer a bacher, right? In other words, there is no such thing. Once we reach adulthood, there is never a vacation from furthering the beautiful spiritual maturation of my soul. So the Gemara goes right. So we'll say, it's an interesting case. There's a mountain. And what happens? The mountain, so again, we've already established if we worship a mountain, nothing happens to the mountain. Let's say there were stones dislodged by themselves from the mountain. So in other words, no one dislodged them. They crumbled by themselves. And what happened? An Akum worshipped the stones. So the stones became dislodged by themselves, and Akum worshipped those stones. What is the status, ultimately, again, of the stones? One opinion said, Aser, bless you, V'chad Amar Musaros, and one said, it's mutter. All right, machlokas, my taima, demand the Amar Musaros. I'll say, by the way, I just want to point out, do you understand like the enormity of what it is that we're doing right now? Right? We just spent the day literally again in the abyss of pain, right? Overwhelmed by thousands of years of collective pain. And so you would think like, okay, so what does a Yid do after such a heavy day? You relax. What do? We get back to business. Yes, there's a time to cry and a time to mourn, but at the end of the day, I have to learn. I have to move myself forward. I can't stay steeped in the past. I need to move myself forward. I need to eat something. I need to catch my breath a little bit, and then I need to get myself right back to the base medrash, right back in front, or if I'm not in the base, right back in front of my Gemara. It's the nitzchi. What we're doing tonight. This is the nitzchius of Klal Yisrael. This is the eternality of our people. So Gemara invites. So therefore, machlokes. So my time demand on mutaros. What's the reason for the opinion that says that it's mutar? Kihar. Because the stones that were dislodged are no different than the mountain itself. Mahar she'emo tfisas yedei adam umutar. So we'll say, what's the chap of a mountain? The chap of a mountain, remember again, this was the lashon from Shabbos' daf. Ein bo tfisas yedei adam, which means what? It has been unchanged at the hands of man. In other words, we'll say, if I go ahead and I take a mountain and I chisel a picture of an Avoda Zara into it, that may actually create Isser. Why? Because I'm creating something new. Or if I quarry stones from a mountain, I build, not a Jew, but an akum builds an idol, then that's going to be asr because there was there's human involvement. But in general, the reason why a mountain can't be made asr is because man had no involvement in that. You can't make something asr if it's naturally forming and independent of you. So too again, the stones that become dislodged. The akum didn't dislodge them; they became dislodged by themselves. Therefore, they're no different than the mountain itself. But 1 second, But 1 second, a har is different. Why is a har different? A har is different ultimately because it's attached to the ground, but yet stones are not attached to the ground. To which the Gemara says, "Behema tochiach." But 1 second, what about a behema? Because we'll say ultimately again a behema is not attached to the ground. But ultimately again, if an akum goes ahead and worships a behema, what happens to the behema? He worships my behema, what happens? Nothing. Now again, nothing is not totally correct. We'll see more in tomorrow's daf that ultimately you can't use it for carbonic purposes, so there is an impact. But Lamaisa, just for head yoke use, there's absolutely no impact, and it's not muchaber. So the Gemara says, "Mala behem shekim balas chaim." But 1 second, but behem was different. Why? Because behem was alive. To which the Gemara says, "Har yochiach." We can prove this from a mountain. B'chazra adin, and this becomes a matter of circular logic. Lo re'izeh k're'izeh, v'lo re'izeh k're'izeh. The truth is the cases are dissimilar, or they're not fully similar. But what is the common denominator? Again, I both say between mountain, har, behema, and ultimately the stones that dislodge by themselves. The Gemara says, "She'ein bahen tfisa sidei adam umutar." So when you look at the mountain and you look at the animal, these are naturally occurring items. And there was no human involvement in these items, and therefore they cannot be made into Avoda Zara. Afkol she'ein bahen tfisa sidei adam mutar. Therefore, any naturally occurring item in which man has not been involved cannot be made into Avoda Zara. Therefore what? Therefore the stones on the mountain which become dislodged on their own cannot become Avoda Zara. Why not? Because again, they're naturally occurring and there's been no human involvement in it. Therefore, the dislodged stones cannot become Avoda Zara. 1 second. So maybe the common denominator between, let's say, the animal and the mountain is that they're both in their original form. But yet the stones which have been dislodged from the mountain are no longer in their original form. Someone says, I'll give you another example. So we both say, what happens if you have an animal that has a mum? An animal that has a mum has changed its state, has changed its form from its original state, and yet still, if an akum worships that animal, he cannot answer it to me. So you see over here that even technically, if something does change its original form, but if there is no human intervention, then halacha l'maisi, the item can't be transformed into a chefza of Avoda Zara. Or you can bring the same raya from an unblemished animal, and ultimately again an ilan yavesh. Ilan yavesh is a dried up tree. So a dried up tree has changed form. But what? There's been no human involvement. So because there's no human involvement, therefore it can't become Avoda Zara. So both say, so again, it's halacha l'maisa, just understand. So remember, what's our case? Right, let's go with what we know. What do we know? I don't know. Right? What we know is like this, a mountain, right? A mountain. If an akum worships a mountain, can't make the mountain aser. That's it, that we know. Now we'll say, so now the shaila is, if stones become dislodged from a mountain on their own, can an akum make that into Avoda Zara? So the first opinion says no. Why? Because the criteria for making something into Avoda Zara, or I should say, the criteria, let's say of a mountain, and ultimately again of an animal, for example, is they're in their original form, and there has been no human involvement or intervention. So to anything that is in its original form, and ultimately again has no human intervention, ultimately again should also, even if it's not in its original form but had no human intervention, can't be made into Avoda Zara. Therefore stones, which although they may not be in their exact original form, there was no human intervention. Therefore, again, halacha l'maisa, they can't be made into Avoda Zara. That's the first opinion. Uman da aser, the one who says it's aser, lahachi ksiv shaketz teshaksenu v'ta'ev tesavenu. The pasuk says, when it comes to Avoda Zara, shaketz teshaksenu should be like shkatzim, right? It should be like disgusting and disgusting to you. Da'afagav da'asya medina le'atera lo tasya. So the second opinion says like this: even though you can make a very solid limud, a very solid right halacha, a solid logical argument that the stones which become dislodged ultimately again should not become avoda, or should not be able to become avodah zara, like the mountain, like the animal. But the Torah ascribes such a negative disposition towards avodah zara that if the item does not fit exactly in the mountain or in the animal paradigm, ultimately it can be made avodah zara. Incredible. Incredible. Gemara says, "Tistayim devei Rabbi Chia tisharu." We can understand that it is the sons of Rabbi Chia, ultimately again, who said that the dislodged stones ultimately were mutter. Were mutter. How do we know this? The boy Chizkiah, because Chizkiah has the following question. Let's listen to this interesting case. Zakaf beitza lishtachavos la mahu. What happens if someone took an egg and he stood the egg up upright? And then he worshipped it, right? Or I should say, he went ahead and he stood it up upright in order to worship it, to bow down to it. Mahu, what is the status of the egg? We'll say first wide line. So we'll say, so we're assuming over here, he stood the egg upright to worship it, and he worshipped it. In other words, he did the maisa and he actually worshipped. So what's the shaila? And here's the shaila. Is the act of standing an egg up upright, is that considered to be an action? Is that what we call tfisas yad adam? Is that human intervention or not? Aval lo zakaf lo misra. But ultimately, again, if you did not stand the egg up upright, everyone agrees that what? That if you worshipped it, nothing would happen to the egg. Why? Why not, Rabbi say? Because again, it's naturally forming and there was no human intervention. It must be therefore you can learn from here that it was the sons of Rabbi Chia ultimately again who permitted it. To which the Gemara says, 1 second. Maybe not. Maybe Rabbi Chia were the ones who ultimately were answered. And maybe if you bow down to the egg, even if you didn't stand it upright, ultimately it's asur. What's the case over here? Kigon shezakaf beitza lishtachavos la v'lo ishtachavela. Interesting. You put the egg upright to worship it, but you didn't end up worshiping it. So what's the status? Ulaman. Ilaman damar avodas chacham she'yisrael asura miyad asura. So if you hold ultimately again that the avodas chacham ma'akum, right? Avodas chacham, avodas zara, avi Yisrael is asur immediately, then this is asur. But if you hold that no, even the avodah zara of a Jew is only asur once it is worshipped, ha lo palcha. In this case, the intention was to worship the egg, but the egg itself was never actually worshipped. Lo tzricha, the Gemara says, no tzricha kigon shezakaf beitza lishtachavos la v'lo ishtachavela. What's the case? The case is where the Jew stood the egg up upright. Why did he do that? He was going to worship it, but he didn't get around to worshiping it. And then an akum came along and did worship it. So the Gemara says, what's the halacha? Ki had the Amr Yehuda Amr Shmuel Yisrael shezakaf levena lishtachavos la uba oved kochav vishtachavela asura. So listen to this. If a Jew went ahead and stood a brick up upright, with the intention to worship it, but he didn't get to it. And then an akum came along and did worship it. So what's the halacha in that case? Ultimately, again, it's asur. It's asur. So the Gemara says, "V'kami baile leveinu deminkara zikifasa." That's only in case of a brick, because when you stand a brick up upright, it's discernible. It's observable. Ava beitza lo, but ultimately again, but maybe an egg, when you stand it upright, it's not such a discernible act. Al dilma lo shna, or perhaps again, there's no distinction. To which the Gemara answers, teku. Teku, okay. We just look at Teku on Shabbos, right? Teku. Ultimately, again, the Gemara says we'll have to see. Wait till Eliyahu Navi. And we'll say, just understand what is chos. What is chos on Motzei Tisha B'Av to have a mention in the daf of Eliyahu Hanavi? Wow. Right? Not every daf has a teku. Daf good tonight. HaKadosh Baruch Hu whets our appetite for Geula even more. It's so close. It's going to be here any day. We have our first teku now, Motzei Tisha B'Av, ready for Eliyahu Hanavi Zachur Latov. Incredible. All right, we'll say, so what is the halacha in this case? Right, so let's go back for a second. In our mountain case, you know what the halacha is. That if you worship a mountain, you do not make... Now when I say you understand, I'm not talking about a Jew, because Jews and Avoda Zara are even more complicated. If an akum worships a mountain, he does not make the mountain asur. Our shaila was, there are naturally dislodged stones from a mountain. He worships the dislodged stones. What's the status of the stones? Machlokes. So I just you should know the Rambam paskins that it is mutter. The Rambam treats naturally dislodged stones as the mountain. Why? Because the Rambam accepts the model that we just advanced now, which is if something is naturally forming and there was no human intervention, then halacha lamaisa, it cannot be made into an object of avodah zara by an akum. That's how the Rambam paskins. Good. Let's go right there. Another case. Shmuel, thank you for the seltzer. Mostly just so you should know, I don't know if everyone here knows, the drink fridge, which again is not for mincha munchies, myriv, dry mouth, or a number of other pre-existing conditions, is stocked by Shmuel Arman. So just so you should know. Some people think it's a nace. It's like one of the miracles. It's kind of like, it's just like the be'er of Miriam. The water just keeps coming out. It's actually not. There is human intervention over here. Rabbi Shmuel, after mincha today, I saw him carrying a case of water, right? A case of water stocked every day. We have Rabbi Ari always making sure that the coffee flows like water. Rabbi Shmuel making sure that the drink fridge is always stocked. It's beautiful. It's beautiful. We'll say thank you very much. Shkoyach. And there's a QR code also to contribute on the side if you would like to. It flows freely, but it is not free. The Gemara says as follows. Rabbi said as follows. We'll say next case. Last line, Mem Bava Mashi. Thank you. Hamishtachave lahar avon of malam is X. We'll say. So now I want to point out something interesting. So up until now we've been focusing on the use ultimately as if you worship something. What is the license to use it? Ultimately, for what we call hedyot purposes. Hedyot purposes. Now the Gemara is asking a different question. So now that we've established, ultimately again, that if you bow down to a mountain, right, the akum bows down to a mountain, it does not make the mountain into an avodah zara. Here's the shaila. Can you use the stones of that mountain, ultimately again, to build a mizbeach? To build a mizbeach. Right? Can you use the stones of that mountain to build a mizbeach? So once I see here the difference in the shaila over here, so we've already established that to use it for mundane purposes is fine. The shaila is, can you use it for kodesh purposes or not? And we'll say, incredible, Gemara about Mizbeach, allusion to the Beis HaMikdash. We got Eliyahu Navi, now I've got the Beis HaMikdash. Incredible. So the Gemara says, Yesh ne'evad b'mechubar eitzel gavoa, Amud Beis, Memba 46b, Yesh ne'evad b'mechubar eitzel gavoa, o ein ne'evad b'mechubar eitzel gavoa. So we'll say, the Gemara's question is like this. This is an interesting expression. Do we say that even something that is attached to the ground, right, ultimately, again, can be made into avodah zara for what we'll call kodesh purposes, right? In other words, because kodesh, right, hekdesh is holier, the holier you are, the more sensitive to impurity you are. This is true on a personal level, right? True on a personal level. That's what I say. Sometimes, we're on such a great trajectory with our kedusha, our personal kedusha, and then we slip up, like in what feels like such like a minor way, and we're so disappointed in ourselves that we made a mistake with something so minor. So I should have been able to resist. But it's important to understand that the holier you are, the more receptive to tumah you are. That's the way it works. So therefore, the Gemara is asking over here is, I understand that if an akum worships a mountain, he can't make the mountain into avodah zara. But if he does go ahead and worship the mountain, does that preclude the use of the stones of that mountain for the mizbeach or not? The Gemara phrases it as yesh ne'evad b'mechubar eitzel gavoa o ein ne'evad mechubar. In other words, do we say that it is considered to be a worshipped item, even though it's attached to the ground, vis-a-vis kodesh, or not? Take a look at one Rashi just back on Amud Aleph for just a moment. Last Rashi on the daf on Amud Aleph. It really belongs in Amud Beis, but let's look at it here. So we'll say, so for example, we're going to see, we haven't seen this yet, but we will see it. If an akum comes along and let's say worships my animal, right? My Gentile, my akum neighbor comes and worships my animal. My sheep. What's the status of my sheep? What's the status? Mutter. But what we are going to see is it is mutter. So if I want to make a barbecue, I want to eat it, no problem. You cannot offer it up as a korban. This is interesting. See, even though, and again, there's a lot, what's the logic? You can feel that logic. That logic is somebody worshipped it for idolatrous purposes. I'm not giving that to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. So now the Gemara, that concept exists by an animal. The Gemara is now asking, The Bali Chaim Asul Gavoa Afal Gav, the Afal Gav, the Shari Lahedjot. Even though, again, that same sheep, I could eat it for dinner, right? But Lamaisa, I can't use it for a carbon. So that's the Shaila. So do we say that if the Akum goes ahead and worships a mountain, can I quarry stone from that mountain for the Mizbeach? That's the Shaila, okay? Second line down. Imtin Salomar, Yesh Ne'evad B'mechubar Itzal Gavoa. So again, if you say that no, if an akum worships something, even if it's attached to the ground, it cannot be used the gavoa, it cannot be used for temple purposes, then do we say machshire karban ke karban damo olo? So do we say Abosai? Now I understand by an animal, right? If the akum offers up worships my animal, I can't offer that up as a carbon. That makes sense because that's the direct carbon. A mizbeach is what we call a hechsher carbon, right? In other words, the mizbeach is what enables the carbon to occur, much like a knife, right? Much like a knife. So do we say that it's a problem even for the mizbeach, which is not direct carbon, but what we call a preparatory part of carbonic service? Amar Rava, Kal v'chomer, Rabbi's Kal what's Kal v'chomer? Uma esnan shemuter b'talosh lahedyot, aser b'mechuber legavoa. So this is interesting. So we'll say esnan zona. What's an esnan zona? Person goes to a zona. Again, not recommended, right? But again, person goes to a zona, and what happens? He pays her. So he gives her an object as her payment. Okay? That's called an esnan zona, a harlot's payment. The halacha is you cannot use a harlot's payment for anything in the Beis HaMikdash. So the Gemara says like this. Now, if you give an esnan zona, is mutter ultimately again be talosh. Ultimately again is mutter with detached items, but it's aser b'mechuber. In other words, if she received something detached, then technically speaking, could be used to the Beis HaMikdash. But if she receives something attached, mechuber, it is aser legavoa. Where do we know this from? Lo savi esnan zona u'mechir kelev. Ultimately, again, you cannot go ahead and bring an esnan zona. Mechir kelev means something that was exchanged or sold for a dog. It's considered to be a lack of kavod to bring something that was sold for a dog or exchanged for a dog to the Beis HaMikdash. Losh natalosh v'losh namechuber. Ultimately, again, it doesn't make a difference. Ultimately, again, if it is attached or if it is detached, right? So see what's happening over here. So an esnan zona. Let me just clarify this. An esnan zona is mutter b'talosh lahedjot, right? In other words, that let's say Reuven goes to a zona. He pays her with a sheep. Zona gifts Shimon the sheep. Is Shimon allowed to eat the sheep? Is he allowed to eat the sheep? Yes. Right? Now, Shimon can't offer that sheep as a carbon. That's legavoa. But for hedyot purposes, utilizing the payment of a zona is not problematic. It's permitted. It's permitted. Now that's only, but so talush is mutter lehedyot, but yet mechuber is asr legavoa. So therefore, again, if the esnan receives something that's attached to the ground, whatever it might be, that cannot be donated or utilized for the Beis HaMikdash. The Gemara says, good. Ma esnan shemuter b'talosh lahedyot, aser b'mechuber legavoa, dichsev lo savi esnan zona, o mechir kelev, lo shna talosh v'lo shna b'mechuber, ne'avad she'aser b'talosh lahedyot. So we'll say ne'avad. So remember again, if you have ultimately again something that was worshipped as Avoda Zara, it is if it was detached from the ground, it is aser even for mundane purposes. Eino din she'aser b'mechuber legavoa. Then certainly again, if it's attached, then it should aser be aser even for gavoa, even for Beis HaMikdash use. Well, I can reverse that argument and I can say as follows: Uma ne'evad she'aser b'talosh eitzel hedyot. So we'll say ultimately something that was worshipped. When it comes on, again, and man ne'evad she'aser b'talosh, right? If the akum worshipped a detached item, so remember again, halacha l'maisa, that item is still mutter for mundane use. This is our case before. The akum comes and worships my sheep. That sheep is still permitted for my mundane use. Yet what? Yet again, as eitzel as a hadyot, mutter b'mechuber legavoa. But interestingly enough, if the akum worships something that is mechuber, that is mutter even for the Beis HaMikdash. So for example, if an akum goes ahead and worships the mountain, so again, if the Beis HaMikdash somehow has use for that mountain, that is going to be mutter, because an akum can't answer something that is mechuber. Shneimar, Eloheihem al ha'harim, v'lo ha'harim Eloheihem. Right? We're speaking about Avoda Zara. It's their gods that are on the mountains, and not the mountains which are their God. Lo shna lehedyot, lo shna legavoa. To which the Gemara says, Esnon shemuter betalosh lahedyot. Eino din shemuter b'mechur legavoa. So therefore, an esnon, if it's detached, is mutter for regular, ordinary use. Ultimately, again, should be mutter even if it is mechuber for Beis Hamikdash use. V'im yishum Beis Hashem Elokecha. What are you going to do with the fact that it says Beis Hashem Elokecha? What do you do with that? Now Rashi says over here, Rashi is almost right across, a couple lines up. V'im yishum Beis Hashem ubois lemeimar debayis havi mechuber v'ka'aser. It sounds like it's only answering. It says Beis Hashem Elokecha, just like a home is attached. So it sounds like it's only answering that which is mechuber by an esnon. That's different. I need that phrase for something else. What do I need it for? Beis Hashem Elokecha prat lepara she'ena ba'a lebayis divrei Rabbi Elazar. So I will say this is fascinating. What does Beis Hashem Elokecha teach us? Only items that are fit for entry into the Beis Hamikdash technically could be disqualified as an esnon. So for example, let's say Reuven goes to a zona and he pays her a para aduma. He pays her a para aduma. The zona then has hirhure tshuva, and she decides, let me donate this para aduma to the Beis Hamikdash. Are we allowed to accept such a donation? The answer is yes. Why? Because para aduma is not done in the Beis Hamikdash. Where is para aduma done? Right, Haramishcha, Harazeisim, right? Opposite, the mountain opposite. Remember, you looked into the Beis Hamikdash, but it was the only sacrificial item, really, that is, it's not really a sacrificial, it's a different type of item that is shechted outside of the Beis Hamikdash. So incredibly enough, so that's what Gemara's Beis Hamikdash comes to exclude, that if the zona was paid with a para aduma, that para aduma is actually mutter for use. The Chum say, no, it comes to exclude, it comes to include the rabbos as harikuim. That if a zona was paid with, let's say, gold sheets, like plated gold, that cannot be used in the Beis Hamikdash. Amrlei, ana kamina l'chumra va'at amrit l'kula. I'm trying to phrase this kal v'chomer to yield the chumra, and you're using it ultimately again to create the kula. To which the Gemara says, kula v'chumra l'chumra parchinon. Whenever you have a kal v'chomer, and the kal v'chomer could be learned out one of two ways, either to yield a stringent result or a lenient result. We always learn it to yield the stringent result. Really? Is that true? Whenever we have a kal v'chomer, the kal v'chomer can be learned out stringently or leniently. That's true. We always go ahead and learn it in a lenient way. Is that true? Sorry, in the stringent way? So the Gemara says, what about Vaha Hazah de Pesach? What about the case of Hazah on Pesach? Now I'll say, what's the case of Hazah on Pesach? If you take a look at Rashi, this is literally right across in Rashi, right to the left. Hazah be Pesach, Tomei Meis, Shechal Shvi'i Shelo Lios B'Shabbos Pesach. Suppose it's a fascinating case. You have a guy, we'll call him Reuven, and Reuven became Tamei Tumas Meis. What's halach when you come Tamei Tumas Meis? What do you need? Paraduma, 2 sprinklings. One of the sprinklings, day 3 and day 7. What happens if day 7 is Shabbos Erev Pesach? Shabbos Erev Pesach. Are you allowed to do the sprinkling on Shabbos Erev Pesach? Now, I will say, at first glance, you'd say to yourself, well, what's wrong with sprinkling on Shabbos Erev Pesach? So remember, again, I will say, let me ask you this question. Are you allowed to be tovel kelim? Are you allowed to immerse utensils in a mikvah on Shabbos? Why not? Right? So it's machlokas, whether it's makir patish or tikkun mana. On a Shabbos perspective, you're fixing something. Right? You're changing the state of something. So the same way in which one can't go ahead, and that's why, by the way, that's why, interestingly enough, there's a whole discussion about Tvila for Hilchos Nida. Tvila on Shabbos. We're allowed to go to the mikvah on Shabbos. So because we paskin Tvila bizmana mitzvahi, so therefore, again, remember, at most, the inability to tovel utensils is d'Rabbanan. It's going to be what we call a shvus, right? So again, if there's something overriding the shvus, like going to the mikvah, like for a woman going to the mikvah, she goes to the mikvah on Shabbos. That's why, by the way, interestingly enough, let's say a woman was supposed to go to the mikvah on Thursday night, but she missed going Thursday night. Halacha l'maisa, she can't go on Shabbos. She's not allowed to go on Shabbos. The only time a woman's allowed to go to the mikvah on Shabbos is when it's called the tvila b'zmana, right? When literally, again, that's the night that's the first night that she's available to go to the mikvah, but you can't defer to Shabbos night. In any event, Gemara says, what happens in this case over here, where the 7th day of the sprinkling, ultimately again, is Erev Pesach, that Shabbos. Are you allowed to sprinkle on that day? So Gemara says, the pligi Rabbi Eliezer, Rabbi Akiva. Ultimately, again, it's a machlokes in Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Akiva. If you look, quick look at Rashi, Rabbi Eliezer, done kal v'chomer l'chomra, diktani amar Rabbi Eliezer, v'aleh ani dan, So Rabbi Eliezer, again, we don't have to go through the whole Kal V'chomer, but Rabbi Eliezer, right, there's a Kal V'chomer that they're both making. And Rabbi Eliezer understands the Kal V'chomer l'chumra, the Kamachayev leila gavra. He understands it ultimately again l'chumra, and therefore again you have to do the sprinkling. But Rabbi Akiva l'kula, Rabbi Akiva understands it l'kula, ultimately again upater. So what do you see from here? You see from here that not every time that you learn a Kal V'chomer do you automatically assume that we judge it l'chumra. The kaparech Rabbi Akiva l'kula, and ultimately we're asking Rabbi Akiva, how could he dash it l'kula? This nan heishiv Rabbi Akiva. O chilif, Rabbi Akiva himself acknowledges, maybe we could learn out the opposite way. If ultimately, again, hazah, sprinkling on the person who's tameh is an issa d'Rabbanan, what we call a d'Rabbanan or shavus, is an issa d'Rabbanan. Ultimately, again, self-sprinkling, which is only a shavus, is not docha Shabbos, shchita shidaraisa l'kol shekain, then certainly, again, shchita, which is a daraisa, shouldn't be docha Shabbos, in which case, then I will say, what is that saying? In which case, then Allah Lamaisi shouldn't even be able to shech the Kar Pesach on Shabbos itself, since shchita is an actual malacha, to which the Gemara says, Hasam, Rabbi Eliezer Gamrei v'iyaker le Tamuda. In that case, it's not really machlokes. Rabbi Eliezer was one who taught the limud, but also he subsequently forgot what he had learned. V'as Rabbi Akiva lat kure. And Rabbi Akiva had come along ultimately to remind him of that which he had previously taught. V'hainu damar le Rabbi al takbireni b'shas adin. And that's why he said to him, Rabbi Akiva said to Rabbi Eliezer, do not disagree with me in the time they were adjudicating this. Kach mikubal ani mimcha. This is what I learned from you. Hazah shvus, hazah sprinkling is a shvus, ve'ena docha es Shabbos, and ultimately again will not set aside ultimately Shabbos. So we'll say, so going back ultimately again, going back to our original question, right? So what do we do with this Rami Bar Chama? So halacha l'maisa. What do we do with these stones that ultimately, again, were detached from a har? So obviously, they are absolutely unequivocally permitted for mundane use. That we've already established in the previous sugya. Should you use them for the Mizbeach? Ultimately, the Rambam paskins they should not be used for the Mizbeach. So the Rambam holds again that this din, even though it's clearly not asert al Avoda Zara, right? We've already established that beforehand. But halacha l'maisa, when it comes to use for a Mizbeach, ultimately better not to use it. We'll say, we'll just begin the next question, then we'll stop here for tonight. So, next. So this is very interesting. What happens if you bow down? Again, I keep saying you. The akum bows down to standing grain. Kama schitim, right? So again, a standing grain. Can you take that grain, ground it into flour, and use the flour for a mincha? So, right? So there's the worshipped item, and now you're changing the state of the worshipped item. Can you use that ground flour for a mincha? So what's the shaila? Yesh shinui b'nei avad, or ain't shinui b'nei avad? So what's the shaila bosai? So do we say that if something's been worshipped and then there's a change in state, does that remove its worshipped status or not? Right? So bosai, remember, halacha l'maisa, if the akum bows down to standing grain, what's the impact on the grain vis-a-vis me? What's the impact? Zero, right? Why? Naturally occurring and no human intervention, right? So it didn't do anything. But as we've already seen, Hektish, Kedusha, Beis HaMikdash is more sensitive to these things. So now the akum bowed down to standing grain. So now, again, can I take it, grind it into flour, and use that for mincha? Now there's a shinoi. I understand it was worshipped. If I change the state of it, does that allow for its use as a mincha? So yesh shinoi ben avad, or ain't shinoi ben avad. Amar Zutra beid Rav Nachman Tashma. Kol asrun lekab mizbeach v'ado sem mutarin. I will say not. Stop over for tonight. Shkoyach everyone. I know we went a little bit fast. Shkoyach everyone. We'll pick up here. Meretz Hashem Shir tomorrow. We'll start a little later. We'll start at 5:55. Meretz Hashem. Good. 5:55. Start good. 6. You want to go for 6? 5:56, Yankee. Is that what you're asking? Or 6? 6. All right, stay tuned. Be ready for 5:55.